PF rules are crazy, and it seems like almost no one has actually read the rule book. So I went through and I read it actually for the first time yesterday, and there are some insane things in there that are not regular norms on the national circuit and might have wide-ranging implications if people start actually using them. So, first, what are the rules? Here are the top five rules that I found in the rule book that I think people could use and are probably going to be shocked by. The first one is about fiat in PF debate. Now, I know that everyone knows there is an explicit rule in the rule book against having formal plans and counterplans. What I did not know is that there's also an explicit exemption for kind of like baby plans and baby counter plans. It says at the bottom of this rule that while you can't offer a formalized comprehensive proposal for implementation or counter implementation, you can offer generalized practical solutions, which does imply some degree of fiat for the neg as well as the AF in addressing some problems. So I'll give some examples of how this might work that I think are very out of the ordinary, and might change some rounds in interesting ways. Although they're not very powerful arguments, they're not counterplans and plans after all. They can definitely have interesting implications that can shift the tide in a debate. So the first question is kind of like a topicality question when you're examining the wording of these rules. Um, Obviously, what we know is two things. You can propose anything you'd like or counter propose anything you'd like as long as it is not formalized or comprehensive and is generalized and practical. This is totally unclear. Like there's no actual definitions for what any of this means in the context of debate. You just kind of gotta go with your gut, I guess, or find cards that define these terms. But they're certainly not defined in the context of debate. So it seems like they're supposed to be defined in opposition to one another. Like formalized is intended to be an antonym to generalized, and maybe comprehensive is intended to be an antonym to practical. But it does seem like intuitively you are allowed to say some things that don't have a plan text or counterplan text, but still function in similar ways. So here are some things that to me intuitively satisfy the criteria of being generalized and practical while avoiding being formalized or comprehensive. One is kind of the equivalent of a plan, but a generalized practical version. Also might be called an intrinsicness test, which is a term from policy debate that's used to test whether or not a disadvantage is actually intrinsic to the plan. One example is like on the nuclear waste topic, maybe one of the disadvantages is like if you have more nuclear energy, then you put more nuclear waste in indigenous land. But an intrinsicness test or a mini plan that is generalized and practical would just be don't do that. Just instead, we're actually going to put the waste in other places that are better. This is not like a plan text, right? It's not a formalized comprehensive proposal. It's just a part of what you want to do. That has some bearing on the implementation, but the only bearing is that it's a practical solution to one of the potential problems that you might run across. And it's a very obvious solution, right? Just like don't do it in that way, and then we're good. So it seems to pass the sniff test for being generalized and practical, while also having a significant influence on the debate, because it seems like this, if you win it, is terminal defense on any disadvantage about putting nuclear waste in indigenous land, for example, unless they prove that this is something that is inherently required by the resolution. The next is the equivalent of a counterplan on the neg. One example on this topic for September and October might be there are lots of other things that the government could do to improve security at the southern border instead. Maybe we just increase personnel or something without it having to be a formalized, comprehensive proposal. I'm not sure how powerful this is, but the point stands, right? You might be able to find generalized practical solutions that can take away a significant amount of the uniqueness from the AF. And the final one, which does a similar thing and functions a little bit like impact defense, is the equivalent of advantage counterplans in policy, which is just something that the AF can easily perm, but is nonetheless important. And taking out one of the impacts from the round is something like, there are lots of other ways to prevent your impact scenario of war. Like we could just use diplomacy. We should just do diplomacy instead of requiring the AF to de-escalate tensions for whatever particular reason. There would still be a debate to be had there about whether or not diplomacy is enough. And it's actually very similar to just reading a normal piece of impact defense that diplomacy works, just with an extra bit of fiat that says we will do diplomacy because I said so, so that you can't get hit with a response that's like diplomacy is unlikely to happen, because you're kind of fiating it in the context of the advantage counter plan, but still in a generalized and practical fashion without it being like an actual counter plan text that's like, here's how we're going to do this other plan instead. So very interesting stuff. Turns out I was completely wrong about fiat in public forum. The second example of a rule in public forum debate that is very interesting is about paraphrasing. Now, this one is interesting for the opposite reason. It's not like something that you are banned from doing. It's something that you're explicitly allowed to do, which I did not know existed in the PF handbook, but apparently paraphrasing is something you may do. Paraphrasing may be used. It's an explicit sentence in the PF handbook, so I guess it's true. There are interesting implications for like if this actually allows you to paraphrase and beat paraphrase theory, like are you allowed to use the rule book to answer a theory shell? Like the theory shell says no, paraphrasing is bad for evidence ethics, etc. And you say no, but the rule book says I'm allowed to. Interesting implications for that theory debate. We will answer more of the questions about how that might actually go down later, but I wanted to note it. Really interesting thing that pops up in the rulebook. The third one is about evidence challenges, and this one is big. This one is big, and it has explicit rules for how the judge should adjudicate it. And it explicitly says it's always drop the debater. You always lose for it. So just to be clear on all of these, like this document that I'm taking these from is called the Unified Manual, Unified Rules Manual. It's the High School Unified Manual 2024-2025. And just in case you're wondering, these are not recommendations, they're explicitly rules. Like I'm taking these all from the public forum section under main event rules. So these are certainly intended to be rules and not just suggestions. And I think this is an example that makes it especially clear, because you do have actual like round deciding consequences if you have bad evidence. I think most people do know about evidence challenges. Like I knew about evidence challenges before I actually read the handbook. You just, if someone is completely misrepresenting their evidence, then you can call an evidence challenge to stop the round, and then the round's result is entirely decided by whether or not the evidence is false or not, or if it's being falsified in the round. If it's being egregiously misrepresented, then they lose. But if you do an evidence challenge and you're wrong, then you lose. There is some risk to doing it. What I didn't know about evidence challenges is there are a few interesting like criteria and requirements that someone can fail to meet that also can initiate what seems to be a legitimate evidence challenge with a much lower bar than I previously thought. One of them is failure to produce a card. Specifically, I have this highlighted portion. It says, if you're paraphrasing evidence, for example, and I ask for your evidence, and you just give me like the website, for instance, the original source, but you don't clearly indicate the paraphrase text. So for example, in the written text, the standard practices of underlining, highlighting, minimizing what you don't read is definitive. If you don't do that stuff, or at least indicate it, mark it up in other ways, it does say the word marking evidence. If you don't do that at all, and you just produce the website, then you functionally don't have evidence, and this is under the section for what is a legitimate evidence challenge. In fact, it does say see 7.2b3 for the penalty for failing to clearly indicate the paraphrase text. And if you go to that section, here's 7.2b3. It says, if it lacks the original source marked clearly in these ways to verify the accuracy, then this is a definition of an evidence violation, and a definition of an evidence violation that you could then do an evidence challenge against. So if it's not formatted for identification of what you specifically read, you just lose. Like that's incredible to me, because I've been in so many PF rounds in which students just produce the website and don't have a cut card for a particular card. I know that the norm has moved very far away from that at this point, especially at the national circuit. But still, I think that like 1 in every 10 rounds or so, especially in rebuttal, for instance, or other speeches in the round that are not constructive, people will cite evidence that they only have a link for and they don't have the full highlighted cut card for. That's technically grounds for an evidence violation that immediately ends the round. Wild. Another one is called a straw argument. I didn't know what this was before reading the handbook, but it's very familiar now that I do know it. It's when a debater asserts that an author supports some argument that's part of the author's quote, but is not intended to be their final conclusion. So, lots of studies, lots of articles will have the author be like, here are a bunch of reasons why people think X, but actually a lot of those reasons are wrong. It's unclear if X is true at the end of the day. There are good reasons for not X as well. I don't really know, or I actually believe not X and I don't believe X. But what some people will do is only highlight the reasons for X and leave out all of the other side that the author also considers and the actual conclusions that the author gives. I've actually seen this like several times in PF rounds, and I've made arguments about it in PF rounds as well, but I didn't know this is also grounds for an evidence violation unless the debater actually stands up in their speech and says like, look, I know this is not what my author actually concludes, but it's still a valid argument that comes from the quote. If they do not do that, then it's a TKO. Like the round is over, they lose. This is definitionally an evidence violation that you could evidence challenge, which is wild. The final one, and the craziest one to me, if I'm interpreting it correctly, which I think I am, is that you can lose the round for not providing page numbers in your citation. Not an exaggeration, funny example, but here is a list of 8 things that every single citation must include. Now, a few clarifications. Number one, when I say citation here, I mean the written citation, not the oral citation. The NSDA handbook is clear that when you provide an oral citation in your speech, all you need is like the author's last name and the abbreviation of the date. That's all you need. Sometimes not even the date if it's like the second time you've cited the same author and the same work. Or obviously if there is no date in the publication, then I guess you just read like the organization or the author. But you do need all 8 of these components to the extent provided by the original source in your written citation if the judge or the opponents ask for the card afterward or ask for the citation afterward or in prep time or something like that. Now, obviously, most of the sources, like, they just don't have all of these things, right? Like, most sources that you read in a PF round do not have page numbers. They might not have author qualifications. They might not have a URL, right? Like, that's why it says if applicable here. Some of the sources might be like actual books that you found. But they all have date access for digital evidence, right? The vast majority of evidence these days is digital. I've seen a lot of people not putting the date that they've accessed the card in the citation. Same with like a lot of the other stuff. Like people cite in a lot of different ways. I would say the vast majority of citations do not include things like date accessed, or they don't include author qualifications or page numbers when they are applicable, when they should actually be including them because they are part of the actual evidence. So the way that this works in a round is if you pull up the original source, like they send you the URL, for example, and you find something like page numbers in that source, and they didn't put the page numbers in their written citation, that's technically a violation of the written citation requirements, which is technically grounds for an evidence violation, which would mean that they lose automatically. It sounds like I'm joking. I wish I was joking, but I've read a lot of the clarifications. Like they put a bunch of questions about case by case stuff at the very bottom of the NSDA rules handbook. And it seems like extrapolating from a lot of these questions, like there's a sufficient amount of evidence to believe that this is the correct interpretation of the rule book. Here's one example that asks 2 scenarios about like if they're doing an evidence challenge. The second one is the one I'm looking at, which is if one team is producing the original source, indicating that the opposing team has violated, quote, one or more of the evidence requirements. And the answer is like the other one is not valid, but this one is a valid evidence challenge. So it seems like that is just GG, right? It says the second challenge is indeed legitimate and should be considered by the judge and or tabulation committee. Um, and what are the evidence requirements if not the citation requirements that were just written here? There's like an argument to be made that like that's not actually what they mean. Like certainly the citation requirements are not the same thing as the evidence requirements. These are like two different things. But I don't know. Like here are a lot of other questions that seem to provide extra evidence for this. One of them at the top is like common academic practices require MLA, blah, blah, blah. This is definitely about citations. Um, and it uses the word requirement in the answer. It says teams or individuals should adhere to the requirements listed in the NSDA guidelines instead of MLA or APA. Clearly, again, using the word requirements for citations, which means that the citations are a version of the evidence requirements that, again, the last answer just showed is grounds for a legitimate evidence challenge. The rest of these questions also say similar things, right? Like the full site information has to be available if there is a question. Note the word full there implies probably as many of those 8 things as you can have. And again, citation requirement is the language used in the answer to the last question here as well. So it seems like this is actually weirdly grounds for someone losing the round. Um, that's insane. I don't know what to think of that, but the rules are the rules, apparently. The fourth rule is about debating the resolution. I'm not sure how to think about this one. I don't think I've fully really sat down and thought about what this sentence means, but it's something that people need to sit down and think about. Public forum debate focuses on advocacy of a position derived from the issues presented in the resolution, not a prescribed set of burdens. I'm not going to lie, I don't know what it means by prescribed set of burdens here. I looked for that language and like the other debate event rules and it wasn't there. So who knows what this actually means? I guess like the AF doesn't have a burden of providing a plan, for example, but that seems obvious. What I am focusing on here, though, is you have to provide an advocacy of a position derived from the issues presented in the resolution. Um, that seems to maybe imply topicality, but it also maybe is a loose version of topicality, like derived from the issues presented in the resolution does not sound the same as like on the topic of the resolution or like from the resolution. Derived from the issues is like really loose language that seems to leave open a lot of interpretation for like KAFs, for example, that are loosely tied to the topic that we're debating. Also uses the word focuses on, so maybe this should not be interpreted as a strict requirement, but I would be interested to see how people interpret this in the context of like topicality debates and stuff like that. The fifth and weirdest rule in this entire lecture is this one. It says, quote, no new arguments may be introduced in Final Focus. However, debaters may include new evidence to support prior arguments. This goes against like everything I have ever learned or thought about Final Focus. It seems like cheating to me to like if your second Final Focus, for example, like introducing like 3 new cards that support your first contention, that seems like insane that this is allowed, but it seems to be. Now, one caveat here is that this is the one rule out of the 5 that is not from the same source. So this is not from the Unified Manual or the Unified Handbook or whatever it's called. This is from an NSDA PF sample ballot. So specifically, it's from this thing here. Notably, though, like this is still from the National Speech and Debate Association. It is still like on the website, speechanddebate.org. So it still does seem to be formally like proposed by the NSDA. Maybe it's not a rule, but at the very least, this does seem like a guideline and something that could be cited if someone wanted to do this. I don't know though. Who knows, right? Um, but it does say this at the very bottom, and it says it interestingly alongside some of the same language that was in the unified manual. So for example, it says it alongside the same quote actually. Debaters may offer generalized practical solutions in the context of plans and counterplans. So it seems like it's along the same lines as the rule book, but maybe it does not have quite the same amount of credibility or like bindingness. But I did want to note it because this is wild. If people do use this for anything, I don't know how it would be used because Final Focus is also the last speech in the round, so it's kind of difficult to imagine a scenario in which this would be important. Like maybe you're preempting the judge intervening against you by being like, the NSDA public forum ballots say that you're allowed to introduce new evidence to support prior arguments in my Final Focus, so now I'm going to do just that. But you wouldn't really be arguing with your opponents because there's no room when you're just bringing this up in Final Focus to make like a theory argument, unless you're doing it in second Final Focus, and then first Final Focus would never have an opportunity to use this to answer that. So I'm not sure when this would be brought up, but weird, weird thing in the rules apparently that we should think more about. Okay, so those were my top five wacky rules that appear to be given by the NSDA. The second part of this lecture is going to be a lot of discussion about how to interpret the rules as binding or not, or how they interact with theory arguments and what the judge should do about all of this. So, first of all, yes, the rules matter. Stop cheating, right? This is a handful of arguments for why you should adhere to the rules in the NSDA handbook. The first one is actually pretty ironic, which is lay judges. Most of the time, I think when people think of like calling the other team out for violating a rule, you think of it in the context of theory arguments. And when you think of theory arguments, you usually do not think of lay judges. But this is an exception. I actually think in this case, this is a way to functionally win theory rounds with lay judges. Maybe even better with lay judges than tech judges. And the reason why is because a lot of lay judges, when they're especially first starting out and they don't believe that they know very much about the event, they will default to things like guidebooks and the tab software, recommendations. On the PF ballot, for instance, that we just looked at, they will look at this and they would read it and believe it over any of the debaters and over any coaches. So if you give them the actual NSDA rule book, they will read it and they will think it is the most important thing in the round, probably more than a technical judge who's been around and knows that these things are not actual norms in the activity. So I think it's actually entirely possible to win several rounds just using the NSDA rulebook and the fact that a lot of other people don't adhere to it, because lay judges don't know that this is not a norm to not adhere to it, or that it is a norm to not adhere to these rules. And they will just look at the rules, which are pretty clear, by the way. Like, it doesn't seem like there's that much up for debate about the interpretation of the rules. And they will look at the rules and they will say, yes, yep, you violated this rule. Yep, you lose. And that will be the end of the debate, end of the question. And so it's an interesting way that, like, low key, you could score some quick ballots very easily. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating for you to do this. This is like maybe dangerous information to be giving a bunch of high school debaters who might be prone to using it for nefarious purposes. Please don't like abuse this kind of stuff, right? And like, I don't know, try to TKO random novices because you want free wins. The reason that I'm making this lecture series is because I find it educational. It's fun to think about how theory interacts with rules and jurisdiction. But I don't want to give you a bunch of ammunition to effectively like bully people with weird tricks that are against the norm. Um, yeah, I don't know. Use your brains, be nice to other people, do it in the right way. But it is a strategy that you could use in circumstances where it is competitively viable, but also circumstances where you aren't going to look back on that in a few years and be like, oh, that was kind of a weird thing for me to do. I wish I had just debated that round normally instead. Yeah, so fan of experimentation, but know when to not experiment too close to the sun. The second reason that rules do seem to matter is a theory-derived reason, which is that they are the strongest link, perhaps, into predictability, which in turn might be the strongest link into fairness. So a lot of people, especially in policy debate, they think of one of the most important things in debate is having a stable stasis point that is predictable, that everything else sort of revolves around. After all, we're playing a game. We need to know what the game is that we are playing, and that we both agree to certain rules and standards when we walk into the room so that it's predictable and we can actually prepare for it and be ready for what the other team might throw at us. So in the same way that violating topicality explodes the limits, violating the rules also seems to explode limits. Like they're clearly the rules exist for a reason and they are fair. Even if the rules themselves are not fair, the non-adherence to the rules seems unfair, given that the rules exist for both teams, right? The rules exist on this handbook that everyone has access to, that everyone should be reading. So not following the rules and then complaining about why it's okay to not follow the rules seems to be unfair because the other team is not in a position to predict that you won't follow the rules. It's like picking up the ball with your hands in soccer and then making a bunch of arguments after you've just scored a bunch of goals for why it was okay to do. Even if it would be a better game when you pick up the ball with your hands, even if you prove to the refs that that is the case, they're still not going to listen to you because it's unfair given that both you and the opposing team came into that game with the assumption that you wouldn't do that. So that they wouldn't be able to predict that that you would do that or train against that kind of strategy, etc. The C point here, the third reason for why rules matter, is similar to the last one, but a little bit different, which is that there's an argument that this kind of thing is not something that a judge has the jurisdiction to vote for. As in, if you break the rules in making some kind of argument, it like evaluating that argument fairly lies outside of what the judge is allowed to do. This is an interpretation of the role of the judge as kind of a referee, rather than as like an educator or something. They're there to grade your math test. If you write a bunch of random stuff on your math test, or if you cheat on your math test, they are required to give you a failing grade. It doesn't matter if you argue with them about why that's stupid or the rules are dumb. They still are required by their job to give you a failing grade. That's what they've come to the tournament for. It's like a binding obligation that is imposed by the social role that they are fulfilling, um, given like the rules that are given to them by the NSDA to come into this tournament in this activity and judge rounds. So it's just like the judges are bound by certain limits and what they can or cannot do. And this is one of them. And this, in fact, is kind of built into the language of the rule book as well. It mentions things about judge education that, like, if a judge violates one of these rules or does not consider one of these rules properly, then a decision that they make can be appealed. So the NSDA handbook seems to prescribe that this is a jurisdiction matter as well. So who knows? Maybe this is quite important. The difference is that this does not rely on an external appeal to like fairness or predictability or anything like that, because that seems to be more debatable, right? Like the other side can turn around and read like 7 answers to fairness, but you can't read 7 answers to jurisdiction. It's just, this is just how the judge is in the round. They're constrained by these limits. That's that. The next one is even more sort of constrained and even less up for debate, which is the idea that these rules are constitutive to the activity. As in, if you are not adhering to these rules, you are not playing the game of PF. Like you are just playing a different game entirely. If you use your hands in soccer, you're no longer playing soccer. Great for you. You're winning another game called like kick the ball and use your hands with the ball, but it's not soccer anymore. You're not winning the game of soccer. So it's constitutive to the activity that these rules exist. The NSDA is running these tournaments and it has these rules. If you don't follow these rules, you just aren't playing the game that the NSDA has hosted the tournament for you to play. So it's not even a question of fairness. It's not even a question of jurisdiction. It's just like the judge, it's not that the judge is limited by the rules, as in like the judge is required to play a referee role. It's like the judge, it doesn't matter who the judge is. The judge is someone who is voting for someone who is better at public forum, But if you're not playing public forum because you're violating the rules of public forum, you're not even doing the activity. So judge can't vote for you. You're really good at some other activity, but it's not called public forum because this is how public forum is defined. Um, the final one is even absent all of these, like clearly the rules matter insofar as you can do things like evidence challenges that just do in the round, regardless of what people think, right? Like this is just the procedure that does actually happen. And I don't care how many good theory arguments you have, you can't beat an evidence challenge with a theory argument. So the rules do matter. However, there are a lot of other reasons to think that maybe the rules don't matter or they shouldn't matter very much. This is a bit sparser than the last page because I think there are more reasons that are intuitive for why the rules do matter, at least to some extent, than for why they don't. But there's two here that are somewhat persuasive in my mind, certainly up for debate. The first idea is that, like, some sort of appeal to the rules seems to beg a question of why you're appealing to the rules, right? Like, okay, this is what the rules say, fine, but why do the rules say it? Or why do the rules matter in the first place? Any answer you give to that question will eventually be a theory question, right? Like, the rules matter because they're educational, or this is the rule because the NSDA thinks that it's more fair. But that can also be beaten, right? Those arguments can be answered. So maybe theory controls the internal link as to whether or not the judge even should consider the rules in the first place, or if they should be there in the first place, or if they should be changed or something for the sake of this round. This is the same idea behind just like beating the fairness claims behind why you should adhere to the rules and be like, these are actually unfair rules for these reasons. If you win that debate, then I guess you win, that you shouldn't have to follow the rules. The second part here, I think, is more interesting, which is the idea that it's actually less predictable to follow these particular rules because they just are not in the norm, right? Like no one follows the rule that you can have new evidence in second final focus. No one, to my knowledge, runs like baby counter plans ever. And I've heard zero cases ever of anyone losing for like not having a page number in their citation. So it seems like this is just not something that anyone could ever imagine happening. This is not something that anyone would teach you. This is not something you would ever learn at camp. This is not something that you would ever experience in a debate round or that any of the older students on your team would ever tell you about. So in that sense, maybe this is actually less predictable, which controls a stronger internal link to fairness. And it just seems like you're actually just abusing these random rules that you found on the internet that no one actually follows for free wins. And that does seem bad, like legitimately. So maybe there's a case to be made for instead honoring the spirit of the rules rather than the strict text of the rules. And an intuitive reason why is the same as like the silly laws problem in the US, right? Like there are a lot of US states that have really stupid laws. They're like, you're not allowed to walk a llama through town square at midnight on Tuesday. And these are like clearly outdated. They don't seem to have any reason behind them. And also, if someone did do that, like they would not be arrested, and they wouldn't probably be able to predict that they would be arrested. It's also similar to other laws that people do know about, but would never be able to predict that they would be penalized for. Things like jaywalking, right? Are things that we know are technically illegal, but a lot of us do all the time because we know that they are not enforced. So actually, ironically, enforcing them would seem to be a greater violation of justice than not enforcing them because the norm of non-enforcement has been so strong for so long. You would expect that a just system would have to inform you if they were going to start changing the degree to which they enforce these rules. Um, so that's one intuition behind why maybe these particular rules should not be like round ending necessarily and should not be considered as much by the judge. The final question in my mind here is like, these are three visual representations of how you can imagine rules and theory. I actually want to talk about number two and number three first. So model two is the model that I think a lot of people believe in, which is that the rules establish a constraint on what you are allowed to do, right? Things like speech times, for example. The judge is not allowed to evaluate any of your arguments that happen after 4 minutes of constructive has passed. And so in that sense, we have this like bold circle where everything outside of that circle is not gonna fly. But you can also imagine limiting that circle further with arguments that happen in the round. There are theory arguments. So maybe this involves something like disclosure theory. Like you're also not allowed to not disclose, and you're also not allowed to maybe paraphrase. Even though these things are not in the rule book, they can be added in this red circle to further limit what people are allowed to do. This is a model a lot of people subscribe to. Seems fine. Model 3 is the more extreme version in the theory direction, which is like, screw the rules. Theory is the only thing that matters. And theory not only constrains what you might be allowed to do within the rules, it also might allow you to do things outside of the rules if you properly justify them with theory. Um, it does seem like there are practical limits to this. Like most judges I know would not allow this to fly in the case of speech times, for example. You can't say like, here are 5 reasons I should be able to speak for 6 minutes and then get away with it. Usually does not happen, even if your reasons are conceded and very good. Model 1 is the one that I think is the most interesting to consider for the sake of the discussion in this lecture, which is the idea that the rules are all there are. It is completely arbitrary for a player in the game to make up rules about the game mid-game. And it's ridiculous given that there is a rule book and these rules are not in that rule book. Like imagine if a soccer player mid-game, maybe they weren't like, let me pick up this ball with my hands. That's not allowed by the rules. But maybe the rules say nothing about like picking up the ball with your shirt or something. Or maybe the rules say nothing about whether or not other people are allowed to do certain kicks. Like maybe they say, hey, it's completely unfair for you to have all of your defenders line up for our free kick. So actually, you should only be allowed to use 2 of your defenders, and the fact that you didn't only use 2 of your defenders should mean that you automatically lose a point in this game. That seems ridiculous, right? In the context of like sports and stuff. Like in any other game, we would never allow this. And part of the reason is because there already is an established list of rules that define what you cannot do and define what you can do. That's the important part, is there's an interpretation of this rule book that interprets it as a complete rule book, as in it anything that you can do is something that is not prohibited by the rules, and anything that you can't do is prohibited by the rules. But there are no other things. There are no other things that should be prohibited that are not textually prohibited, and there are no other things that should be allowed that are textually prohibited. It is a comprehensive list of all of the rules of the game, and that is that. There is no room for theory. The circle is just one circle, and the theory is just defending that one circle, and that's all there is to the game. In this context, there is some allowances made by the rules as well for things like paraphrasing, right? If we go back to rule number 2 in our top 5 silly rules, it's like debaters may paraphrase. That seems to be an argument that you could leverage under this interpretation of the rules as defense against any paraphrase theory allegations. So just to conclude all of this, seems like there are some really interesting rules in the PF rulebook. I would encourage any of you watching to go read through it yourself. Maybe I missed some. These seem to be very applicable also in like lots of different rounds that can dramatically affect the outcome if you use them correctly. Although you do have to use them with some nod to the rule book to justify them because they are typically so far out of the normal norms that many judges, especially technical judges, might question them, or at the very least, your opponents might question your application of these rules unless you cite the rule book. But it could result in some interesting rounds if you do correctly cite the rule book, and then you get away with this totally different thing that no one has thought to do before in PF. And finally, it raises a lot of questions about theory debate, like if theory debate is even a legitimate way to introduce rules, especially given that there are other mechanisms that are able to introduce rules as well. Like, for example, if we actually go to the speech and debate website, you'll be able to see that there are other ways that you can introduce rules yourselves, which is really interesting. So this website, which is one of the tabs under the speechanddebate.org website, it shows this part right here, the rule change submission form. Um, you can propose any change to the unified manual, submit suggestions for rule additions, deletions, or changes to the board of directors by completing this form. This poses an interesting question for theory because, like, maybe this is a pretty competitive counter interpretation you could run against different shells. You could be like, instead of hashing this rule out with theory, you should just get a bunch of people to submit comprehensive changes to the rules to the unified manual by going through this form so that they're then approved by the board of directors who are very smart and experienced and care a lot more about fairness and education and don't have weird competitive incentives to skew like to introduce weird rules that only favor them or like only favor them in specific rounds and stuff, which is seems to be a problem that is inherent to a lot of theory debate. So arguably, this might be a better solution to things like paraphrasing. Maybe instead of trying to bully me for paraphrasing in this round and saying that it's super unfair, you should go talk to the board of directors by going with your coach and all of your friends, and all of you can just fill out the rule change submission forms. And then maybe next year they will introduce a rule that says no paraphrasing, but only if they decide that that's good and they seem very smart and very well intentioned. So maybe that's a better thing to listen to than the random like intricacies of this particular round that doesn't seem to be a good way of deciding what a good rule actually is. So food for thought for sure. I think this is an interesting thing to consider and one that people do not consider very much at camp. So thank you for listening to episode 3 of this lecture series. Let me know if you have any other things that you want me to give lectures about. Otherwise, I've got 2 more coming up, and then we'll wrap up the series as a whole. Thank you. Bye-bye.